Hey guys, it's Kira and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be doing the mid-year book freakout tag, which I'm so excited about. This is of course my 2020 edition, but it's also actually the first time I'm ever doing this book tag. I absolutely love watching them because I'm super nosy and I love to hear about everyone else's reading progress and their favourite and least favourite books. But I haven't actually ever done it myself, so I'm really excited to be doing it for the first time this year. Just to give a little bit of context, we are of course in June of 2020, and so far this year I've read a total of 39 books, and my overall goal for the year is to read 75 books, which is the same goal that I had last year as well. Now, when I talk to people who are not on BookTube, when I say I've read 39 books so far this year, they always seem to think that that is a lot of books, but in the context of BookTube, where people are reading hundreds of books a year, that doesn't really sound like that much, but I just have to appreciate that everyone has different things going on. I'm reading alongside like my yoga teacher training as well as a full-time job, and so I don't always have as much time for reading, but I'm really pleased with 39 books so far this year. I'm ahead of schedule and I've also read some incredible books. So without further ado, I've got myself a big mug of Earl Grey tea and I'm ready to talk about all things to do with all of the books that I've read so far this year. So let's get into it. I actually have to put the cup of tea down there because it's really hot and I don't want to spill it on my books, so bear with. So the very first question on this tag is, what is the very best book that you've read so far in 2020? And this was such a hard question for me because I've read some incredible books so far this year. I actually have a note on my phone where I'm keeping track of all of my favourite books, because last year when I came to the end of the year and I was trying to figure out my top 10 books of the year, it was really hard to remember because obviously the books that you read the most recently are the ones that are freshest in your mind. So this year I decided to make a note on my phone from the very beginning of the year so that I wouldn't remember all of the standout books throughout the year, and so there have been some incredible ones on the list, and some of them I'll be talking about in other questions on this tag. But in the end, I had to decide on 2 books, which I know is kind of a little bit of a cheat, but I just had to. These 2 books are ones that I actually did a reading vlog on very recently. It was a rereading vlog, so I read them for the first time earlier this year. One I read in January, one I read in March, and then I reread them both in June or May. The very beginning of June or the end of May, I can't quite remember, but I reread them both together, and the reason I did that reading vlog was firstly just because I wanted to reread them because I enjoyed them both so much, but also because I wanted to try and determine which of the 2 books was actually my favourite, and at the end of that vlog I came to the conclusion that it was impossible because they were both so good. They're by the same author, and those books are Normal People by Sally Rooney and Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. I just love both of these books so much, and I genuinely think that these are both not just my favourite books so far of 2020, but the books that I will now be very happy to say if anyone asks me what my favourite book is, these 2 books will be it, because they are both just so incredible. Just to give a quick summary in case you're not familiar, I think most people will be familiar with Normal People just because of the new TV adaptation that came out on BBC in the UK and on Hulu everywhere else in April, and it was so popular. But essentially this is a bit of a romance but with a little bit of a twist, and essentially this book follows the story of 2 characters, Marianne and Connell. The book begins when they're 18 and at school together, and they're just about to leave and go to university, but they kind of kick off a bit of a relationship together. But it's a bit of a secret because in school they're from very different social settings. Marianne is quite a rich person, but in school she has absolutely no friends and she's a bit of a loner, whereas Connell comes from a less well-off socially economic background, but he is extremely popular in school and has loads of friends, and so although he likes Marianne and actually feels like he can be himself around her, he actually decides to keep the relationship a secret because he's worried about what impact it will have on his popularity in school. They then end up going to the same university together. They go to Trinity College in Dublin, and the book kind of follows them over like a 4-year period, and essentially we just see them constantly magnetising each other into their lives, and how no matter what happens they keep drifting back into each other's lives. We see them as friends, we see them as in a relationship, and we see all kinds of in-betweens, but they constantly just keep coming back to one another, and so it's a very raw and real look into a relationship. It is not the sort of romance book that has a very clear trajectory. The characters don't end up necessarily in the way that you want them to or hope that they will. It's a very open-ended book, but it's one which really shows all of the ups and downs and complexities of relationships and all kinds of other issues as well. But I just think it was incredible, and I just loved how it showed relationships in such a raw and realistic way. And not to suggest that every relationship is like Marianne and Connell's, but more so the way that it shows that not all relationships are like the romances that we see in books and television typically, and it kind of is a bit of an antithesis to that, and I just absolutely loved it. So it was incredible, obsessed. And then Conversations with Friends, which is actually her debut, so I probably should have talked about this one first, but this is another one which really looks into relationships in a bit of an unconventional way. We have our main character Frances, as well as her best friend and ex-girlfriend Bobby, and they're at Trinity College in Dublin as well together, and they also perform spoken word poetry together. One day when they are performing, they're spotted by a journalist and writer called Melissa, who decides that she wants to write a piece on them. And so because of this, they kind of get invited into Melissa's world. And once they're in there, they kind of get sucked into this very interesting experience. Bobby becomes really interested in Melissa as a person and kind of wants to pursue her romantically, whereas Frances becomes very interested and really hits it off with Melissa's husband, Nick. And so we have this very, very messy quad of relationships where everyone is involved in other people in very different ways. Of course, Frances and Bobby are close, they're best friends, but they also have a romantic history together, and that's kind of still something that's lingering in their relationship. We have, of course, Melissa and Nick, who are married, and then we have these new relationships which are kind of being blossomed between Bobby and Melissa and Nick and Frances, and then there are friendships crossing over the entire group of the four of them. And this is a book which explores the theme of polyamory in a very, very interesting way, because it doesn't explore it in the sense that people are intentionally pursuing polyamorous relationships, but it kind of shows polyamory as sneaking up on them and then them having to confront the ways that they look at romance, love and relationships, and whether or not you can have two different types of love at the same time without one affecting the other. And it's a very, very complicated, really, really interesting. Frances is a very interesting protagonist because she's quite cold, she's very intellectual, and she's difficult to read and kind of has a bit of a wall up around her, but you are seeing the book through her perspective. It's a first person narrative, and so you do feel like you're connected to her, and she's just a very, very interesting character. I'd say as protagonists, Marianne and Frances are quite similar to each other, so if you like one, you're probably certain to like the other. And just in general, I think Sally Rooney's writing style is so captivating. She writes in a very dark, raw and realistic way, which I just absolutely love. So these two are definitely my favourite books from 2020 so far. I had to pick these two because I just couldn't bring myself to pick one over the other. Love them. Definitely need a cup of tea after that. I swear I could just talk about Sally Rooney's books all day long. Next up we have what is the best sequel you read this year, and I actually haven't read many sequels this year because I'm not currently involved in reading many series. However, the book that I ended up choosing was Catching Fire, which is the second book in the Hunger Games trilogy. I read the Hunger Games for the very first time in April, and I actually did it as a 24-hour readathon, so I read all three of the books in one day, but my favourite one on that day was definitely Catching Fire. I just loved the sort of combination of fast-paced action with politics, and I feel like this book, of the three books in that trilogy, had that combination nailed the most. I just absolutely loved it, and that's kind of what I really enjoyed about this series, and this one was just the perfect one, so I definitely enjoyed the sequel the best. Wow, why was that word so difficult to say? Sorry. Next up we have a new release that you haven't read yet but you really, really want to, and this for me is The Switch by Beth O'Leary. Last year I read The Flat Share for the first time, which was Beth O'Leary's debut, and I absolutely loved it. It was incredible and ended up being one of my favourite books of last year. I just think it was so good, and it was all about this unconventional romance. And so when I knew that Beth O'Leary had a new book coming out this year, I was so excited to get it, and I actually just picked it up like literally last week because here in the UK, non-essential shops, which includes bookshops, have finally been allowed to open. So I went into Waterstones and had to pick up this book because I'm just so excited to read it. And essentially what I understand about this book is that it's about a young girl who's taking a little bit of a break from work and an old lady switching places to kind of like jazz up their life and figure out what they want to do and kind of just like where they want to be in life at this current moment for them. And so it sounds really interesting. I think it's going to be really fun. I'm not sure it's going to be quite as good as The Flat Share, which was just incredible, because this premise doesn't sound quite as intriguing to me, but I just loved Beth O'Leary's writing style so much, and I'm sure that this one will have been incredible. And one of my favourite things about The Flat Share was the fact that it was a dual perspective, so we had both of our main characters and their perspectives right throughout, which I think was perfect for the style of book, and I think that is exactly the case in this book as well, so I'm sure I'm going to love it, and hopefully I'll be reading it very, very soon. Next up we have What Was Your Biggest Disappointment from the year so far, and for me this would have to be Bunny by Mona Awad. I picked up this book because I was on such a dark academia hype at the end of April and beginning of May. I'd read The Secret History and then I'd read Ninth House, and I was really enjoying this dark academia vibe, and this is a book which is set at a really fancy college called Warren in New England, I believe, and it's essentially a college which is very artsy, and our main character Samantha is there for a creative writing MFA. She's on a very selective course. There are only 5 people, and Samantha is a bit of a loner because the other 4 girls are part of a group called the Bunnies, and that is essentially what this book focuses on. We have this very cult-like group where we have this group of 4 girls who all call each other Bunny, and they act in really weird ways and have nicknames for each other, and it's all very strange, and Samantha absolutely despises them at the beginning of the book, but then somehow she gets invited into their little warren, if you want to call it that. And that's kind of where the book kicks off from. But this book was written in such a confusing way. I really, really didn't like it. I also have spoken about this in a couple of wrap-ups before, where essentially it leaves too much open, and having talked about it with a few people, it leads people to think about things like mental health and schizophrenia. It's a subject that comes up quite a lot when talking about this book, and I think that's really dangerous when you haven't officially addressed a diagnosis. The author didn't absolutely definitively say that Samantha was dealing with any particular mental health condition, and so I think leading readers to have these open perceptions about what she may be going through, and then associating the very strange and violent behaviours that she's engaging in with that said mental illness is just really dangerous and leads to some really not very good representation. And so the confusion, the openness, and I feel like the dangerous aspects of this book and the way that it potentially represents mental illness just made this one to be a really, really disappointing read for me, so I wouldn't recommend this one, I'm sorry. Next up we have What is your most anticipated release for the second half of 2020? And to be perfectly honest, I am terrible at keeping up to date with new releases. I honestly am the worst at it, so I'm probably not the best booktuber, to be perfectly honest, and I really do rely on other booktubers and their videos about new releases to keep me updated, unless it is one that is really, really popular. So I don't actually have a huge amount of new releases in my mind that I'm looking forward to. I'm sure there will be plenty that come out, but I just don't have that many in my head. But one that I have been looking forward to since it was announced is Loveless by Alice Oseman. So I've read 3 of Alice Oseman's books so far. I've read Radio Silence, which was the first one of hers that I picked up. I've also read I Was Born for This, which I really, really liked. And then earlier this year, I also read the first volume of Heartstopper, which was my first ever graphic novel, and I really, really loved that one. It was so cute and just wholesome and lovely. And so I've really enjoyed Alice Oseman's writing style. I think her writing style is just really, really captivating, and I love the way that she explores so many different issues, but also just has really entertaining stories as well. And then I also just like that she is a British YA author, because I feel like there's nothing wrong with the fact that most YA books are American, but it does mean that as a British reader, it can sometimes be slightly harder to relate to those specific experiences that are relating to American high school or college experiences, because those are naturally different to the ones that we have here in the UK, just because the school systems are different. So it is nice to find British YA authors that are really, really lovely to read, and so I'm really looking forward to Loveless coming out, and I'll definitely be reading that one as soon as I can get my hands on it. Next up we have What Was Your Biggest Surprise of 2020 so far? And for me, this is a book which I actually read very, very recently at the beginning of June, and I absolutely loved it, but going in I had no idea what to expect. It was one of my birthday presents from Jay, and I'd never heard of this book before being given it, so I had no idea what to expect. And also, when I read the synopsis, it sounded kind of similar to me to A Clockwork Orange, which is a book which I didn't really love that much and wasn't really my vibe, and so I was a little bit worried that I wasn't going to enjoy this book either, or that I'd find it really difficult to get into, but in actual fact, I absolutely loved it and read it in like a day. Stupidly, I've left my copy of this book on my shelves upstairs, so you'll just have to make do with a picture of the cover on the screen, but that book is The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. This book was absolutely incredible, and also even more so when you consider that the author was only 17 when she wrote the book. I just think that's so amazing. Obviously, it's incredible when anyone writes a book at any age. However, I'm always so impressed when people write books when they're so young, because I just think it's such an incredible achievement and just shows how talented they are. So I was immediately impressed by that fact, but then the book in general was just so captivating. It was a really, really short one, and like I said, I read it in a day, super easy to get through, but really, really impactful, and definitely kind of made me want to cry, which doesn't happen very often. This book follows our main character, Ponyboy, which is kind of the thing that made me feel like it was going to be similar to A Clockwork Orange, because that has some very strange uses of language, and I was like, this is going to be really weird. We've got a main character called Ponyboy, one of his brothers is called Soda Pop, and I had no idea what I was getting into. But it turns out that they just have slightly weird names, and that doesn't really reflect what's going on in the rest of the book. But essentially, we follow our main character, Ponyboy. He is, I believe, 14 years old, and he's currently being looked after by his oldest brother, Derry. Derry is now the guardian of Soda Pop and Ponyboy because their parents passed away, but there's a lot of tension between wanting to make sure that these brothers stay together. They're from the less well-off side of town, and so there's a lot of pressure on Derry to make sure that he's keeping them in school, that he's making sure that they're well looked after, and that essentially he keeps the family together. And so there's a lot of pressure and a lot of tension there. And essentially, like I said, these boys are from the less well-off part of town, and they're from a group called the Greasers, which is essentially a gang, and it's just made up of those people who are less economically well-off and come from a certain neighbourhood in this town. And then their rivals are called the Socks, and essentially they're just the people who are much more well-off economically. And these are rival gangs, and there's always tension and fights going on between them. And then at some point, relatively close to the beginning of the book, a massive issue kicks off, and there's a big drama which kind of pulls Ponyboy and all of his friends, the other people in his gang, and of course his two brothers, into this big drama, and there's a lot of tension going on. A lot of uncertainty and just a lot of drama. But really, this book was just so captivating. I feel like I can't really go into the plot too much just because of the fact that it is so short, so I feel like anything I say will really be a spoiler. However, I just loved the way that this book showed a social commentary on the way that your economic background and where you live in a particular town can have such an impact on your outcomes, in the way that you'll be perceived by other people in society, and just essentially your own view on what you can or should try to achieve. So it was a really impactful book, really interesting, loved all the characters, it definitely made me want to cry, and I just thought it was so good. But was definitely a surprise because I had no idea what to expect, and to be honest, I expected not to like it, so to then come out loving it as much as I did was such a welcome surprise. Next up, we have your favourite new author from the year. So that could either be a brand new debut author, or of course an author that you're just reading for the first time this year. And given what my two favourite books were from the beginning of this video, I'm sure it'll be no surprise that my favourite author is Sally Rooney. And again, like her books are not just my favourite books from 2020 so far, but I think my favourite books ever of all time. I'm pretty sure Sally Rooney is an author who I could confidently say is my favourite. I just think she's absolutely incredible, and I could read anything she wrote, I think, and still love it. I just think she is so talented and just incredible. I'm obsessed. And then we have your newest fictional crush. Now, I wouldn't say I'm someone who really obsesses over fictional characters, but if I had to narrow it down, I'd say it would either be Connell from Normal People or Mr. Knightley from Emma, both of whom I absolutely loved. And then newest favourite character is really difficult because I do find myself really liking most protagonists that I read about. I think when I'm reading through someone's perspective, I find it really easy to get into their mindset and really, really like them. But the character I've gone for is actually a character whose perspective we don't necessarily get all that often, but who I actually loved, and that is Amy March from Little Women. She's by far my favourite of the March sisters in this book. I just think she's incredible. I love the way that she is not necessarily a perfect character. She has her flaws. She can be conceited and judgmental and a little bit snobby, but she's also very well-meaning, and I feel like we see her go through quite a significant amount of growth through this book. I always see people really judge her as a character and think that she's so much worse than Jo, but I actually think they're both very headstrong. They're both sort of a little bit like too focused on themselves and are a bit too willing to push other people aside for their own goals. And I think in actual fact they're very similar characters, so it always surprises me when people love Jo but don't really like Amy, but I personally like them both. So next up we have, is there a book that you've read so far this year that has made you cry? And like I said when I was talking about The Outsiders, which almost made me cry, I'm not someone who cries reading books very often, but one book which I read earlier this year and I actually did a reading vlog for was A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, and this book, to be perfectly honest, absolutely broke me. I'll have the vlog linked for you so you can go and see exactly how devastated I was, but to summarise, I would say that I probably used up my entire 2020 store of tears just on this book, and it probably didn't help that I read it in 24 hours for this reading vlog, and so it was a very emotional day. I did love this book because of how emotional it made me feel, because I feel like it just really stirred up a lot of emotion, and for me that just sort of spoke to how well the book had been written and how invested I was in the characters. I won't go too far into the plot of this book because for one thing it's really big, and for another thing it's also a little bit of a controversial book in the sense that it deals with some very dark and very difficult to read about topics, particularly relating to childhood trauma and all of the things that come along with that. So I don't want to go too much into it here because this is a happy video about all the books I've read so far, and I don't want to discuss anything that might be upsetting for anyone. I will leave in the description box below, along with the link to my vlog, a list of all of the trigger warnings for this book because it does deal with some very dark and difficult to read about topics like I've already mentioned, and it's a book which I would be very wary about going into if you're unsure about how it will affect you. For me, it affected me on an emotional level in the sense that I was attached to the characters and really felt like I was really empathizing with what they were going through, and it is an emotional book, but it's not one which affected me on any deeper level in the sense that I didn't have any connection to the things that it was discussing. And for me, I was completely fine to go into this book, read it as a story and not be affected in terms of my mental health. But I can 100% imagine that if you had any sort of connection to the issues that it's discussing on a more personal level, you might find this book really difficult. So like I said, the trigger warnings will be in there. This book will definitely make you cry, and I'd be wary about going into it. It's one which I love and would love to be able to recommend to people, but because of how wide the array of issues that it talks about are in this book, I'm just a little bit wary about sort of recommending it as such, because I think it is a very personal thing. And obviously look into those trigger warnings and decide for yourself whether or not this book is the right one for you, but I do think it is incredible and definitely made me cry, to answer the question. And then to contradict that making me cry, we also have, what is a book that has made you happy? And for this, I've got two books again because I'm a cheat and indecisive and I just cannot bring myself to decide a lot of these things. So the first one I've got is Emma by Jane Austen. This book was incredible. I read this one in March, I believe, and just absolutely loved it. It's definitely my favourite Austen novel that I've read so far. I do still have 2 left to read until I've read all of her works, but so far this one is definitely taking first place, and I can't imagine that changing because of the fact that this book was so funny, so light-hearted, and just such a breath of fresh air when it comes to classics. I do love classics, and some classics I go into expecting them to be quite sort of serious and sort of moral in the way that they're written. Little Women is a great example of that, and I go into them expecting that one, but this one was just such a breath of fresh air because it was so light-hearted and didn't take itself too seriously. It's a book which focuses on our protagonist Emma, who is a young girl. She's from a very wealthy family and she is the mistress of her father's house, and so she's got a lot of freedom and doesn't really need to focus on marriage for herself because it's not something that she needs to do socially, because she has plenty of money herself and has a lot of freedom and doesn't really see the need to get married. And so instead she focuses her attention on trying to matchmake other people, but she's not necessarily as good of a matchmaker as she thinks that she is. And so there's a lot of humour and controversy that goes along with that. And we also see Emma as a very, very imperfect protagonist. She's a well-liked character, but she's also someone who could be very judgmental, conceited, has prejudices against other people for no reason other than she just doesn't really like them. And so we see her having to confront those issues, but I think having her as an imperfect protagonist who is just kind of going along with her life and making mistakes along the way just makes her very, very relatable and just a lot more realistic than the protagonist that we get in a lot of classics, because I do feel like females in classics are held up to these very, very high standards of perfection, and it's nice to have someone who kind of challenges that. And I think Jane Austen does that in a lot of her female protagonists, but Emma is definitely my favourite. So this book was really, really funny, light-hearted, and definitely made me very happy. And then the other book which I've got which really made me happy is another recent read. I read this one at the beginning of June, and that was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This was a book which has been on my TBR for a long time, and I finally read it for the Make Your Myth Taker readathon, and I'm so glad that I did because it was such a captivating and beautifully written book. It's a book which absolutely transports you into the world of the Night Circus and makes you feel like you are right there in the circus, experiencing all of the wonder for yourself, and that sort of transformative reading experience where you really feel like you have been taken into the world of the book just made me so happy, because I feel like at the end of May, beginning of June, I was kind of experiencing a bit of a reading slump, and this book was just exactly what I needed to really sort of take myself into a fictional world and be absolutely captivated by a story. And so this one definitely made me happy, and I'm so glad that I finally read it because I now understand why most people seem to love this book so much. So next up we have what is the most beautiful book that you've read so far this year, and for me this is a book which I actually ordered very recently. I still need to read it, but I'm in love with the cover design, and that is With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo. I think this book is so beautiful, the design is just exquisite and I'm in love with it. I think it is one of the most captivating cover designs I've seen in a really long time. It's very, very unusual but just so beautiful and just like faultless. I think it's incredible. I love the really unique maroony, deep purpley colour that they've used as a base, because that's a colour I don't think I've really seen used in a book cover design before. I think the illustration of our main character is absolutely gorgeous, and then my favourite part is all of the little fruity illustrations that are on the book. This is a book which I believe is about our main character who is training to become a chef, and so I believe that food is a big part of this book, and I love how that comes across in the cover design. As you'll probably be able to tell from the other videos on my channel, whilst I love talking about books, the other thing that I love talking about and making videos about is food, and I feel like food is something that I don't see coming up in books nearly often enough, and I love it when books really delve into food as a main focus. And so I'm really, really excited to read this one, and I love that the food is a key feature on the cover, and I'm so excited to read it. But for this question, this is definitely the most beautiful cover I've got because I just love it. I think it's incredible. And then the final question for the 2020 mid-year book freakout tag is, what are the books that you really want to read before the end of the year? And to answer this question, I'm simply going to say, what are the books that I don't need to read before the end of the year? Because my TBR is ever growing and I have so many books left to read that I just don't think I can summarise it in this video. I'm also definitely a mood reader, and so there are lots of books that I really want to read. A couple that I've mentioned, I obviously really want to read With the Fire on High. I really want to read The Switch by Beth O'Leary. But there are so many books on my TBR that I really, really want to read, and who knows which ones I'll be getting to before the end of this year, because I might decide that I want to read a book that I've never even thought about before, or I might get to ones that have been on my TBR for like 2 years. There's no telling what I'm going to do because I'm such a mood reader, and unless I'm reading for a very specific challenge, I really don't plan too far ahead in terms of my reading, just because I just don't find that that really works for me. So lots of books left to read, but who knows which ones they'll be. So that brings my mid-year book freakout tag to an end. I've absolutely loved talking about all of these books, and it's reminded me how many incredible books I've read so far this year and gotten me even more excited for all of the other incredible books that I'm sure I'll be reading in the second half of 2020. If you've done the mid-year book freakout tag, definitely let me know in the comments down below, because I'd love to go and watch it. Like I said, I'm super nosy and love hearing about everyone else's thoughts on the books they've been reading and how they're getting on with their 2020 reading progress. And if not, just let me know what was your favourite book that you've read so far in the first half of this year. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.